Okay. All right, well, I want to go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to this webinar. My name is Sue Robinson. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a former journalist. Actually, I was a longtime journalist in New England for most of my life. So it's so great to be a part of this here. I wish I could have come back to Boston for this. So I'm here with Joy Mayer. She'll introduce herself in a minute. All right, well, Joy, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? I just want to mention one thing. This book that I wrote came out today, and I'll put a link to it in the chat, but it might be of interest to some of you. It's about how journalists engage according to their identities. And I rethink what it means to build trust. And it's an applied research, which means all of my research and data and evaluations go into learning and then to training into newsrooms with organizations like Trusting News. And so with that, I'm going to introduce Joy Mayer from Trusting News, who most of you probably already know.
Hi, guys. It's so nice to be with you today. I come from a background in newspapers and teaching, but I'm a journalist, not a researcher. Sue brings both to the table. In 2016, I started this project called Trusting News, where we learn as much as we can about how people decide what news to trust and try to empower journalists to show up with humility in their relationships with the people they aim to serve and demonstrate credibility and just actively work to earn trust day to day instead of expecting it. And that is just getting more and more complicated. And so I'm so lucky to have been working closely with Sue over the past couple of years as we learn as much as we can about how the lens through which people see the world affects both how they do journalism and how they show up as news consumers and what they're looking for in the news landscape.
Yeah, and so what we want to do today is sort of take you through some of the work that we've been doing both internally with newsrooms around thinking about difference, thinking about hiring difference, thinking about having conversations and dialogue around difference, and also externally with community members and how we can bring that new understanding about dimensions of difference with our audiences. So we're going to talk about those three things. And our main goal, though, is to get you our three guides. And so we have three guides. I'm going to put them in the chat. I believe Linda also sent them around in an email. But these are existing on the Trusting News website, and they're include a very specific, these are very specific guides on how to start talking with your newsrooms about the different kinds of differences, not just racial, not just gender, not just sexuality, but like politics, and whether you have veterans in your newsroom, whether you have religious people in your newsroom, whether people own guns, like all of these dimensions we need to understand in our newsrooms. And then also, well, how do you hire staff? And do that legally, right? Because there's all sorts of laws around what kinds of questions you can ask. And so these give you very specific questions that you can ask of candidates. They've been vetted. And finally, how do you actually host listening sessions, right? Because that's not a skill that we typically are taught in either our newsrooms or in our J schools. And so this also tells you, how do I handle a listening session that's very different from an interview, right? Okay, so we came to these and actually Trusting News, you should really visit their website. They have a huge resources page, and it has tons and tons of different kits and guides and all kinds of things that are based on research or based on evidence-based applied work that we have figured out over the years, and particularly Trusting News has done. So they've spent 2 years working with 75 different newsrooms, training journalists in how to talk to their newsrooms, helping journalists host those listening sessions. We're going to talk a little bit about what happened over those years. And so also, they have partnered with me at the University of Wisconsin, and then my research team, which includes Josh Darr from the Louisiana State, soon to be of Syracuse, and also Patrick Johnson at the University of Iowa. So we've been hanging out with Joy and reading through all the transcripts and hanging out in the listening sessions and hanging out in the training sessions, and then figuring out what has worked and what hasn't worked, and then tweaking all of that training for the next iteration. So the reasons for the work include everything from bringing your own values and assumptions to our work, making sure, because we're so we have been taught in the past to compartmentalize our different identities, not talking about them, put them aside, don't put political signs up, don't tell people how you're voting. And instead, we need to be neutral and so-called objective when we talk to people. And so asking journalists to now talk about those identities it can be difficult to understand how those are still influencing our coverage. And then also, because journalists tend to be upper income, highly educated and white, although those are changing very, very a lot along with our society, we don't necessarily reflect the audiences that we're trying to cover. So how do we overcome that disconnect? And then when we start accounting for those different kinds of differences, we can start being more aware and mitigating those identities, particularly when they're different from the communities that we represent and that we're trying to cover. And then we can also lean into our different colleagues' experiences, right? If we're writing something about gun ownership, for example, it's helpful to have somebody who feels very strongly in the newsroom about that, to talk through like different nuances of coverage and make sure we're not inserting bias or inserting, unconscious stereotyping or something like that. I think that's great. I think there's one more, right, Joy? Yeah. And then having those very open, nuanced dialogues in the newsroom also makes for better story ideas, more story ideas, different kinds of angles, and allows us to really start approaching our different communities with more informed, with more care, and how that works.
So all of these conversations are not only because it's a good idea for organizational culture to get to know better the people we are on a team with, but fundamentally the purpose of this is better journalism. And the ways that we can provide more accurate, nuanced coverage that feels relevant to and reflective of the complex, diverse communities we serve, that is made easier if we acknowledge internally what we know and what we don't know, what we see and what we don't see. So there are some ways in which we do this really naturally. Like in my last newsroom, I was the only one for a while who had small kids. And so when there were stories about like, I wonder how the elementary schools are handling this or something, people would say, oh, go ask Joy, right? The way that we sort of lean on each other, like, oh, Scott likes to fish. So if you're doing a story about outdoorsy stuff, go talk to Scott. There are all these ways in which we see in newsrooms that people are instead feeling discouraged about bringing their full selves to their work, and ways in which we don't see clearly what we're missing in our communities, what the gaps are, because some of these conversations aren't happening internally. So I've been working with Eve Perlman of Spaceship Media on this concept we call dimensions of difference. What are the ways in which we each show up? What are the complex factors of our identity? And how do those show up in newsroom conversations and then ultimately in our coverage? We're really looking at the relationship between individual journalist, newsroom, and community. So first, we start with some identity mapping exercises, like what are our own experiences with criminal justice system, with disabilities, with caregiving, with geographies. Are we mostly urban people, small town people? What's our relationship with faith, and where do we show up there? What are immigration experiences? Just this set of identity factors that affect the lens through which we each see the world. And then we talk in this workshop and in this Dimensions of Difference guide, we'll share a link to, about what those all add up to collectively. So isn't it interesting when we look at our individual experiences, then you can start to line those up with each other and say, what are the assumptions and values that we bring to our work collectively as a newsroom? And what might we, what experiences and values do we not have ourselves? And how do you sort of compensate for that? Then we look at who our community is and how journalists are different from our community. So we know, as Sue was referencing, that there are things about what the researchers call social homophily, things about the people who make up newsrooms that are the same. And we know that, especially as newsroom staff shrink, we're less likely to have people who haven't been to college. We're less likely to have people who honestly are from the towns they're covering in a lot of cases. We're less likely to have people, 7% of the US are military veterans and only 2% of journalists. So we know that there are just a lot of differences. And so what we're looking at is this three-way relationship and what the gaps are there. So allowing us to start identifying and talking more openly about what we see and what we don't see allows us to have some more humility about that, to sort of recognize that there are things we might be missing. It is not threatening to say in a newsroom, gosh, we don't have anyone with young kids right now. Somebody call a friend and run this story idea by and see what we might be missing. That's easy. We've always done that sort of thing. It's not that journalists aren't curious about that. It's just that there are certain topics where it feels safe. It feels less safe for someone to be sitting in the newsroom saying, like, gosh, the way you're covering this religious community or this neighborhood or this issue, how many people in your newsroom are gun owners or feel really comfortably with gun culture? How many people in your newsroom identify across polarizing issues like abortion and guns? How many people understand really innately kind of the values that drive that? What about experience with criminal justice? What about experience with immigration? How well represented are some of the views of your community in your newsroom? So another interesting fact I'll share is that we know journalists are likely to live in big blue bubbles. That's just as newsrooms consolidate, that's where a growing percentage of journalists live. But 22% of journalists actually live in New York, DC, or LA, compared to 13% of the workforce. And the reason I want to mention that is that it affects all of us where national news is produced. When people say, gosh, journalism is not relevant to me. Journalists see the world differently. Journalism is not made for or by people like me. Well, if they're sitting at home watching national television, which is where a lot of people get their news, that's true. Across New England, people looking at national television and thinking, God, do they even understand like what life is like in my community? The answer is very likely no. So that, of course, we can't all fix what happens on national television, but just understand that we are part of the media landscape, and that as people form opinions about how their lives are chronicled by journalists, part of what they're holding journalism accountable for is this idea of sort of a disattachment. If you're interested in reading more about that, I can recommend this fantastic book by Nikki Escher, who writes a lot about place and how kind of the distance between journalists and audiences, and how that's sometimes a geographic distance and sometimes it's a psychological difference, that journalists fall prey to this social sorting that the whole country's doing, where we hang out with people who think like us, we talk mostly to people who think like us, and whether that's online or in person. And even if we live in a community where people have a lot of diverse, rich experiences, it's very likely that our own social circles have us talking mostly to people who think like us. So I think that's an issue really worth exploring. So if people are not seeing themselves in the news in general, that's worth being aware of, but it's really worth asking about our own journalism. How do people who see the world through different lenses feel about whether journalism is reflecting their lives? So this is not a question of whether our values should drive our work and whether our own perspectives and lenses on the world should be visible in our work. It's actually really important, I think, that newsrooms talk about what we stand for and what we as individuals, what drew us to journalism, what we're trying to accomplish. And if there's a set of values that you feel really strongly about and that drive how you show up, that's wonderful. This exercise is not about erasing that from our work. It's making sure that we are intentional about what those are, so that we can say, it might be that our work drives us to provide coverage through a lens of equity, for example, through a lens of, sort of a presumption that the diversity of our community is worth celebrating and makes our community stronger. We can have that as a value that shows up in our work, even if other people don't see it that way. It might be fine with us if we differ from our community. It's not a matter of having to reflect our community exactly. It's just a matter of recognizing where there might be gaps and making sure that our own assumptions and values as individuals and as journalists, that if those are showing up in our work, if it feels concrete and visible and tangible to our community, that we're doing that intentionally, not accidentally. And so we work with newsrooms a lot to look at individual stories and say, who would feel seen and reflected and understood by this story, or who might feel discarded or ignored or misrepresented by this story, and what do we need to do are we comfortable with that, and what do we need to do to sort of diversify our approach there. So there's a big organizational culture component to this work, which is how do we challenge each other's work? If you are sitting in a newsroom, which we've heard from a lot of newsrooms as we've done this work that this is the case, if you're sitting in a newsroom thinking, that story over there, my family in the town where I came from would definitely not use those words, or would definitely not feel seen by that, or would feel really stereotyped by that, or would feel really condescended to by that. Or, what does it look like to be in a newsroom that encourages you to lean into the team sport nature of journalism, encourages you to say, hey, I know I'm not working on this story, but can I just drop in here with a perspective? We know that too often that's not the case in newsrooms. We hear from too many journalists that they feel like talking about their faith in the newsroom would not be advantageous to them, or talking about we've heard from people that call themselves sort of closet conservatives in the newsroom, or who feel like sort of defending where their family would be coming from, or what their friends and neighbors might think about the news, where that feels the dominant culture of the newsroom discourages them from bringing up that contrary view. So we're talking a lot as we do this work about how newsrooms can adapt to make sure that once you bring people on staff who do have a diversity of lived experiences and values, that they are empowered to speak up about them, that the culture adapts to accommodate them and welcome them, rather than just assimilates them into the culture. So just a couple of guides here, two of the resources we want to share with you. With Eve Perlman of Spaceship Media, we created this Dimensions of Difference guide that walks newsrooms through, we've had workshops around them as well, walks newsrooms through this sort of individual identity mapping, newsroom values, looking at who's in your community and what the gaps might be, looking at individual stories. We coach you through identifying the biases and assumptions and values that show up in stories, and whether that's intentional or unintentional, and then how in newsrooms you can talk across those differences to really better understand each other and help each other do more accurate work. And then where this work actually all started was a desire with some of the newsrooms we work with to address hiring, to think how, when you are bringing people onto your team, how do you ask questions that will help you understand how they see the world, and what sort of intellectual diversity they would bring, and what lived experiences they would contribute to your staff's collective. So as Sue was saying, obviously there are legal reasons that we cannot just say to people, so how'd you vote? So tell me about what your family thinks about the world, right? But you can ask questions about things like, what worldviews, values, or experiences are you most curious about, or do you wish you understood more deeply? You can invite people to share how they show up for work and what experiences they have that will help you understand, that will first send a message that you care about those things and that you want them to bring those things to work with them, but also will invite them to share whatever they feel comfortable sharing about that. So our goal, actually, Sue, I think I'll let you talk through what the evaluation showed.
Yeah, I mean, so both, so Dr. Dar at LSU is a quantitative researcher, so that means he does a lot with surveys and experiments, and I'm more qualitative, so I do more with the observing of the trainings, and we interview And I also help with the surveys, which are mixed, both open-ended and closed-ended, just to let you know that that these trainings, these interventions that Trusting News has been doing, we're actually, you know, putting through rigorous research methods to figure out, like, okay, how do these work? And so it's really fascinating how much of a difference these activities that you probably haven't done before can actually make. And so, you know, we have asked all of those newsrooms that we worked with, how did this work? We've asked them to go ahead and log how they do things, like when they're thinking about headlines and word choices, what words feel inflammatory to them, you know, how do they hear back from audiences? We asked them to log all that. We've had a number of newsrooms, dozens of newsrooms helping us out, just trying out some of these guides and some of the parts of these guides. So that's how they came from. And what we find is that these journalists report feeling way more self-reflective about hiring, that those hiring practices feel more holistic. They feel like they are able to insert some more representation into their newsrooms. We hear that they are having different conversations in their newsrooms, conversations that are very productive and that help generate new story ideas. And also access different kinds of audience segments, right? Because we're all interested in expanding our audiences and finding new revenue sources. And this work can help prep the newsroom towards those new opportunities. It also has nuanced specific audience relationships that often we either don't have great access to, or we've ignored completely because we don't have the sourcing to it. This work allows newsrooms to start building those kinds of relationships, but also nuancing the relationships they already have in different kinds of communities, and making that coverage sort of more dimensional. And therefore allows for a better, you know, sort of public deliberation about community issues. And then finally, transparency has been such a key word for all of us, probably since the 1990s, but we take it into a whole different level that we really weren't supposed to do before, as I had mentioned. Now, you know, this kind of transparency, and also Trusting News on their resources page has a lot around, like, how can you explain to readers what ethical decisions you made around this big story, or who are the sources that you talked to that didn't make it into the story? How was this story fact checked? All of those kinds of values that we know audiences want, more honesty, more truths, right? We've heard that, and more transparency. This kind of work leads in newsrooms towards achieving all of that.
So let me just mention before Sue's going to talk about the next strategy we want to share. We will save some time for questions if they come up. So I think probably, Linda, correct me if I'm wrong, but probably the Q&A function is the best way to do that. But we'll be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A so that you guys can let us know if you have questions about how you can apply this, or you just want us to elaborate, or if you want to push back on any of this and say it just does not feel like that is something my newsroom would do, or that's different from how I approach journalism. We'd love to hear that as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the nice things about these guides is that you can kind of pick and choose what works for you and for your newsroom. And we've been working with a lot of newsrooms that were like, no, we're just interested in this one area of difference that we want to really sort of dedicate some energy to, right? Like, you can't do everything. You have to sort of choose, okay, in concert with our goals for our communities that we represent and where we want to go topically as a newsroom. You can pick and choose, which is the nice thing. So I'm going to talk now about the community conversations we did. We had a bunch of newsrooms who were willing to host listening sessions with disengaged community members, right? So these are people who were no longer or never had watched or listened or read the content for these newsrooms. And the idea, of course, is that we're losing audience members. We need to figure out how to remain relevant and to find relevancy. And we have to market ourselves to segments that haven't looked at us for many years, right? So you can't just do the good work and expect people to see it, because they long ago don't see it. So it's also about sort of like creating these networks of people who haven't seen your work in a long time, and then showing them what you've been doing. So we've been doing a ton of work around this. And one of the things that we've been doing is, how do we now bring all of these differences that we ourselves understand into relevancy for our content? So we created this listening guide, or Trusting News created the guide, and then we kind of tested it out with nine different reporters who agreed to hold like 8 listening sessions with individual community members over a summer. I think it was last summer, right, Joy? I don't know, my years are melding together. And this guide will help you figure out how to do that, right? So it can't be an interview. It can't even be a conversation. It's just listening, right? And so these are disengaged community members. So they have a lot to say about the news outlets, and particularly your brand. And it's really hard to kind of sit there and listen to what tended to be fairly, critical, sometimes even vitriolic sort of statements about the news that to be untrue. But we really counseled these journalists to not engage, to not get defensive. You can correct misunderstandings, about process, but really this is about the listening, okay? And so we did these, they're open-ended questions. You only do a couple questions. Some of these conversations lasted 20 minutes. Some of them lasted 2 hours. The average was right around 30 to 40 minutes. And the hardest part was actually finding the people, right? Because you can't just put out a notice on all of your platforms, because these people are not on those platforms. So they did it in a variety of ways. Reddit spaces tended to be very popular, Facebook, lots of networking. Some of the journalists went through their families. They had a lot of family members who were very anti mainstream news. And everybody, all the newsrooms wanted this particular segment. Like we had one newsroom that was like, we have a big Native American population, so we just want to figure out how can we better serve the people who live on this nearby reservation, for example. We had another newsroom that was very interested in just immigrants, because they had this growing immigrant population, but they didn't have that as an audience section. We had half of our newsrooms wanted rural or conservatives. They wanted to find that. So you get to choose, hey, which audience segment do we want to grow, and then target your listening sessions around there. And then you look for, of course, influencers and people who are highly networked, or neighborhoods, or you go to places where those particular segment of people might congregate more. You try to use Zoom so that you don't have to worry about transportation. You should think about translation if you're interested in a community that predominantly speaks a different language. Try to offer incentives. This was one thing we were able to do, because we're researchers and not journalists. We were able to say to the journalists, we will pay these community members. I know that people kind of balk at say, we're not going to pay sources, but remember, these are not sources. You're asking these people to come and basically do some branding work for you, right? So they're kind of consultants. So if you can do incentives and you can sort of make that jive ethically with your newsrooms, because you're not using them for story ideas, right? This is not paying them to talk to you for a story. This is sort of different, but that will help getting community members to talk to you.
Can I jump in for just a second? So we have done this a couple other times before this work with Sue. We did a research project a couple years ago that we called Re-engaging the Right. That was, we sent local journalists out to talk to people who lean right in their communities about their experiences with local news. And then we've also done it as part of a workshop we teach on earning trust with communities of color. And I just encourage you to think about this as like investing time in understanding if you're identifying people who have decreasing trust in you, who you're just not connecting with, who you're just not reaching. I'm sure every newsroom can say, you know, who we wish were paying attention to the journalism we offer. So who are those people? And then what is your newsroom doing to understand them? What
Yeah.
is your newsroom doing to understand what they need from the news, what they think of you, what misassumptions you could correct? So I just encourage you to listen as Sue talks about this process and think about who is it you wish you were reaching and what is your newsroom doing? And then I'll tell you, after Sue presents this process, I'll tell you what I wish all newsrooms would do.
Okay, thanks, Joy. Okay, so what we heard, so we had 78 listening sessions, and my research team and I read through all of the transcripts. I do think those journalists deserve some awards for how they responded, and how calm and just kind they were. And we found that these community members as different groups, and they basically lined up with half conservatives, people identified as right-leaning, and half BIPOC people. And BIPOC people, there were a number of different identities represented in that, and they wanted different things, as you can imagine. But so we had these two kind of groups that naturally fell together in terms of our findings. They all felt uncared for. They all felt ignored, and they all felt misunderstood. Those were all of the themes that came out. Not probably surprising to most of you. You've been hearing about it, but especially the right-leaning people, felt very frustrated that the craziest person in the room, and that's a quote from the transcripts, was always the one that was being quoted, and it frustrated them because they don't feel they feel like their views are more nuanced than the most extreme person. The Spanish speaking people wanted a lot more efforts around translations. They wanted a lot more efforts around building relationships within the particularly strong Hispanic and Latinx populations. And they also wanted more partnerships. So for example, there was one segment of people who mentioned these Instagram followers as people where they get their news, right? And so they really yearned for newsrooms to think more expansively about how they get news to and from people, and that maybe they should be partnering with these other sort of news influencers, which is a really interesting idea that before we might have balked at, but now we've changed, right? We have to think about different ways. They wanted to be listened more, and they wanted much more careful headline writing, and that was across both groups. Especially when using politicized terms, right? So for example, this came up multiple times with the Don't Say Gay bills that were happening in Florida. Even our people who were not in Florida, they didn't like that journalists were using Don't Say Gay because that was a politicized term that had generated from the Democrats who were voting against it. And so they felt like the journalists who were using Don't Say Gay, even though it's a nice sort of catchy term, and it's also kind of short and it fits into a lot of our spaces that we need to get it into, they felt that was biased. All right. Keep going, Joy. Let's see. Oh, and so here's the crazy numbers. All right. So we read these transcripts. Some of them were awful. I mean, just like vitriol, like you couldn't believe the things that they were saying. And we also asked them to do surveys afterwards. We asked both the journalists, hey, how did that conversation go for you? We had a whole focus group with the journalists, turned into kind of a therapy session. And then we had the community members to do a survey right away. We said, can you please tell us how this conversation went for you? And 86% of them said that just the act of feeling heard boosted their trust in that news brand. 86%, even after they had just spewed all of this vitriol at the newsroom, they're like, oh, they're pretty good. I actually feel built. And crazy, a third of them said they were considering subscribing. A A third of them. So these are people who were completely disengaged from the brand, clearly had very strong opinions about the brand. And yet after this one listening session, again, 30 to 40 minutes on average, they were like, yeah, I actually might subscribe. I felt really good. I felt respected. I felt listened to. And, so this act of listening is so powerful, which it's hard to scale, right? Because we're super busy and there are a lot of constraints. But if you can manage it, particularly with influencers, people who have access to untapped audience segments, it might be very worth doing this exercise. And the journalists also love them, which we were kind of surprised, right? Because they'd just been yelled at for, kind of hours. But they said they felt they understood the groups better, and because they didn't feel they felt some defensiveness. All right, let's be real, but they felt like just forcing themselves to really listen, to understand how and find areas of connection with these different groups that they hadn't before, helped inform how they were going to approach different audiences differently. Okay, so of course, a lot of stuff came up that we just can't follow through, right? So a lot of conservatives, for example, wanted to be called patriots, or they want to be called constitutional conservatives, which kind of goes against the whole idea of politicizing labels. So I don't know, you have to kind of grapple with this stuff. A lot of the conservatives didn't want any coverage at all of like LGBTQ or Black Lives Matter or any kind of topic that they felt was liberal, right? Any coverage, didn't matter whether they felt the coverage was balanced or fair or whatever. They just didn't want to hear it. They don't want it in quote, I didn't want that stuff shoved down my face, right? So that's how they talked about it. Like literally that's a quote from I think it was shoved down my throat. I feel like that stuff is being shoved down my throat, right? And clearly we can't go back to not covering, people of color, immigrants, LGBTQ, trans people. Like we can't go back. So that was kind of a quandary. Conservatives didn't want to have stories identifying the race of sources, whereas our BIPOC groups wanted that. They wanted more sort of nuance around racial identities. They wanted more discussion about intersectionality. They just wanted more, and the conservatives wanted less. So you have to figure out like how you're going to work with that. We have some tips and suggestions in the guides, I believe. And so word choice is important. This is where the quantitative research came in. Josh has been, and I don't know if he's finished those or not, but he's been doing experiments with so like showing some audiences one piece of content with one headline, one picture, and another group a different one, and then evaluating the reactions to the particular word choice and presentation and all that. And so that's where the quantitative stuff is. All right, let's test some of this stuff out. And then these are some other sort of suggestions we had to sort of think about these quandaries, right? Checking in with people in the newsroom who are more conservative, having some kind of an advisory board, making sure to have that multiplicity of perspectives and not just that most extreme far right one, calling out the lies. Everybody wanted that, everybody across all the groups, but they also wanted you to link to the evidence. And even presenting the primary source documents alongside the story. And then building relationships with more politically diverse people were some of our other suggestions.
So we would love to hear from you guys in the chat or the Q&A if there are things that are coming up for you as you listen to this about what you'd like to learn about your community or what you're hearing about what your community needs from you. Let me just go back for a second and add a few things about the community listening guide. So first of all, the pushback that Sue was talking about that journalists heard about, sort of covering, I live in Florida, so I get a lot of this, like, you're covering woke issues and I'm tired of hearing about it and that sort of thing. One thing that journalists don't do very much of is explain how they're deciding what to cover and what values drive their work and why it's important. So just taking time to say to your community, this community is a lot more it might seem to you that we are doing disproportionate coverage of communities you don't see in your daily life, but that doesn't mean that they're here. And our mandate to serve the whole diverse community and our mandate to be a public service means that we are amplifying voices and experiences so that we can all better understand each other and stay curious about each other. Like, the more that we can talk about that sort of thing and sort of name it, even if I'm not suggesting that will create that will make people who are tired of sort of and see a liberal agenda in your media. I'm not sure I'm not saying that will satisfy them, but being on the record about what our goals are and why those things are important to us can help. So here's what my dream world would involve. All right. These 30 to 45 minute conversations with people who don't trust the news, what Sue said about them feeling really, really valuable and meaningful to both the interview participants and the journalists, that is something we've seen every time we've done something like this. So I think that that's fantastic. And I think it can be really validating and sort of empowering, actually, to be addressing this problem instead of just saying, I sure wish everyone trusted us and understood us better. You'll hear from people about misassumptions they have about your work. You're like, oh my gosh, people have no idea why we have a paywall. They think it's because we're greedy. People have no idea why we're focusing so much on covering these topics. Well, where do you explain that? And so you can take that back to the newsroom and say, what we're hearing from people is this. I think we should explain that, or I think we should draw attention to this, or they're not finding this coverage, or whatever it is. But as you said, it's hard for that to scale. It's not that your marketing strategy for subscriptions is going to be one-on-one 45-minute conversations with skeptical news consumers, right? However, the impact can scale if you handle it systematically. So what would it look like if everyone on your team had one of these conversations a month? So take 1 hour to find someone, set up a conversation, maybe an hour and a half by the time you hold a conversation, and then type up a few notes. Maybe there's a form. I'm actually going to create this and invite newsrooms to do it. Maybe there's a form you use to fill it out. Maybe it's not really a form. Maybe it's a Slack channel, or just wherever your community talks to each other, your newsroom talks to each other, where when you've had your conversation this month, you say, hey, here's who I talked to. 3 interesting things I heard were this. And then maybe it's somebody's job to look through those highlight notes and say, you know what, multiple people are saying this. You start to identify patterns. Mm-hmm. This is not, it's not a small effort, but it's also not a huge effort. And if it becomes the culture of your newsroom to better understand who you're not reaching, and if it becomes the culture of your newsroom to bring those insights back into your decision-making about what you cover, your transparency and explanation and engagement around who you are, I think it can really do a lot for the spirit of humility that I think is so important, and just realizing we are not connecting with people. We think we are. We're showing up, working really hard every day, but what is getting in the way of you actually connecting with people that democracy needs to be invited into your shared public conversation, that your business model needs for you to stay in business and keep serving your community? I think that this sort of using your newsroom to better collect and share insights about your community feels like a really crucial piece of it to me. So we are going to share just a couple things about a couple links from our teams and where you can learn more about that. And then we'll check back in before we sign off and see if you guys have questions. So Trusting News has been around since 2016. We have, for the past couple of years, invested in this effort called A Road to Pluralism that I think a couple folks on the call might have been involved in, where we've done research efforts, created guides like a anti-polarization editing checklist for newsrooms, like a list of words to be cautious with, and just tips for headline writers. So some resources that are co-created with our partner journalists. We have a newsletter that comes out each week, trustingnews.org/newsletter, that shares one quick actionable tip for earning trust. And often it will just include like one quick newsroom example and then strategies for how you can copy it or what you can learn from it. It's got a really high open rate. People who subscribe to this tend to find it useful, so it might be worth checking out. And then we have something brand new that I'm really excited about that launched last week called Trust Kits. And we're taking some of the most basic strategies that we've been developing and training on since 2016 and turning them into like step-by-step guides. One of them involves this community listening, actually. So trustingnews.org/trust kits is where you can find those.
Oh, yeah. So I wanted to add just one thing that Joy was talking about in terms of trying to convince you to engage in some of these listening sessions. The other thing that I study a lot are networks, and how networks information flows through different kinds of networks. My first book was about political discourse in progressive communities, and I looked at how journalists were really enhancing a progressive sort of conversation that was happening. And the result of that was that another conversation that was happening in BIPOC communities was completely siloed. And so one of the things that we've seen is that if you choose a person who's disengaged from your brand, but is highly networked in a segment or community that you don't have a lot of connection with, that person has influence of, like, so let's say that listening session goes well, they feel listened to, they have built trust, they will start talking to their neighbors and their friends and their colleagues and the people in that network. And so that becomes scaled, right? So that one conversation now becomes scaled, and you've built trust, not just with that person, but with this other group over here. So I just want to add that. You probably already know that intuitively, but I'll just state it explicitly. And so actually today, this book came out. And it has a lot of recommendations in the conclusion. It's applied, right? So everything that I came up with, we tried out in one way or another. Some of you may remember the Citizens Agenda project that Harkin was doing with Trusting News, and the Membership Puzzle Project, Jay Rosen. That is one of the projects that I was research lead on. And so that's in here as well. Like, how did that go? What did we learn from that? What were the challenges? And so this has a bunch of tips. So it's very applied. And there is a 30% off happening right now. If you type in AUTHFLY 30 to save 30%, I'll put that in the chat as well. But if this is something that interests you, it's not super long and it's not super esoteric.
I am a little more than halfway through the book. My copy came early this weekend, so I'm enjoying it a lot. I also just want to call out the work of Spaceship Media. Eve Perlman, the founder and director of Spaceship Media, is our thought partner on the Dimensions of Difference work. And she just put out an amazing podcast called The Wedge. It's a project with Colorado Public Radio, where they took a journalist whose experience getting through COVID was in Brooklyn. And her mom, who lives on Molokai, the Hawaiian island of Molokai, and it really like isolated, really different life, and was very suspicious of vaccines and wary of the COVID vaccine. And they're very close, but we're forgetting how to talk to each other across this. And Spaceship Media's focus is dialogue across differences, and how does journalism inform conversations and make us better able to talk to each other across complex differences. So they recorded a 6-part podcast series with this journalist and her mother as sort of an exploration of what it can look like to use information to I didn't get that. Talk across differences. So I recommend that to you. So that I don't see any questions popping up. So I think we'll go ahead and close out. I appreciate your guys' time and attention today. I think Sue just put our emails have been, yep. Thanks, Sue, for sticking my email in there. I'm happy to help share some resources with your team or guide you through any transparency and engagement and trust building strategies that would be helpful to you. And thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, we're always
Thanks
looking
so much, Joanne. So I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead, sir.
I was just saying, we're always looking for newsrooms who are willing to experiment with us. We are ongoing. We continue to try out new things and to see how it works, and then to shift whatever's not working. It's an iterative process, and we need newsrooms to help us out with that. So if you have any capacity, send us a note.
That's great. Yeah, I know. I was looking through. We'll be giving out our awards for our contest, and I was looking through some of the winning entries, and I noticed that a couple of the newspapers won awards for for combating, misinformation and gaining trust by, like, one of them, the publisher writes a letter each week and explains, why they did certain stories and how they did them, and, how it affects the community. And somebody else on their Facebook page, they have all of their reporters, that talk about the different stories that they do and how they interact with the community. And it's just some great tips on what to do and how to engage with your community.
We have a webinar series starting on Thursday, actually, where we walk through some of the basics of these trust kits. And the one this Thursday is about how to explain how you decide what to cover. And we'll have some examples from newsrooms about what people make all kinds of assumptions about what is news and how journalists decide what stories to invest in. And so we'll talk about why it's so important to do that and how you can build into your journalism an explanation of how that works.
Yeah,
Oh, it's
and
great.
we should mention all this stuff is free.
Yeah, all
training's free, working with us is free. Sometimes we even pay you. We've been so I think we forget to add that sometimes, Joy, and they're like, oh, sure, but how much money is it going to be?
Yeah, almost everything we do is free. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thanks
with
so much, guys.
doing.